Ah, Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between. Welcome back to Old Man Rambles. Now, I've had a lot of separate things I may have wanted to ramble about, but I keep coming back to one idea, and that is my thoughts and feelings about a lot of the older books I have in my collection and how my my view of them has changed since I first read them. And I have a couple of things I want to talk about regarding that particular thing. Um, First off, is that I reread a lot of my books, so I'm not like having it isn't like I've read one book the first time, set it down, and never thought about it again. Um, you know, growing up as a kid, I've been reading for 50 years. I've been reading books for 50 years. So that's literal. um, so I mean, as a young kid, I didn't have a lot of money, so you know, I would you know spend what I would occasionally spend my allowance on buying a book, but I had to, my allowance was $1 a week. Books were 95 cents. If I bought a book, that was all my money gone. So I had to really be careful about what I bought. And I had, growing up as a kid, I had a small book collection of maybe 50 or 60 books that I acquired over the course of several years. But because of that, if I didn't have any money and I wanted to read, I would reread the books I had on my shelf, until I started working for a living, or, working in high school and stuff. And even then, books cost money. You had to choose what you spend your money on. And even then, in the course of my life, there are times I've been unemployed, as a teenager, even as, you know, I once broke my leg and couldn't work for a couple months, had no money to buy books then, had to spend it on rent and food. When my wife and I first got married, when we first had our daughter, I was laid off for 5 months, had to cut back on expenses then. And, when these things happen, when money gets tight, instead of buying new books, I would just go to my collection and pull something off the shelves and reread it. Most of the books on my shelf here, um, pretty much anything that's been in storage for a long period of time, I've read more than once, guaranteed. So I mean, these books that I loved, I've read multiple times. It's not like, I'm all of a sudden on a second blush realizing that it's different. No, I've read each book in this little stack right here. I have probably read at least 4 times each. I've always been a fairly fast reader. I can burn through a book a day or two if I really sit down and put my mind to it. And especially books like these. These are day, maybe two tops. Well, these short small books, one day. Profit Math, this bigger one here. Last book I did it for video on, that was like 2 days. And even then, that to me is casual reading. I burned through The Way of Kings, which is 1,200 pages, in 5 days, or less. So I'm a fairly fast reader, and I've read The Way of Kings at least 3 times, probably four, I think now. So, every single book on my shelf, not every single book, but probably 70% of them, I've read at least twice. And that holds true for most of the books in my collection, even the other 600 books that are out my shed. So, like I said, me going back and rereading them and discovering different things about them and discovering I feel differently isn't because I put them down and only read them the one time. I've read them all multiple times, had plenty of opportunities to discover that, these books are not quite as good as I thought they were. So it's not that. I do think some of it is that I have matured as a reader, uh, or become more experienced as a reader. I guess I don't know. I'm more critical of the books that I read than I was 20 or 30 years ago, which some people might think is good, but it does make it harder to like the books I pick up now. Being a more critical reader isn't as fun. It was easier to be happy when I wasn't as critical of the books that I read. When I was content to read a surface level story. Um, and having read as much as I have, I'm aware I've always admitted quite openly that most of these books are fluff. They really are. I've always admitted that they're not that deep. But, coming back to reread some of these books and finding out these books that I loved, that I thought were just so, this book is so awesome. I love this book. Coming back and just like, eh, it's okay. It's a fun read, but it wasn't great. Um, that's been kind of a bummer for me. I'm not happy being a more being a more sophisticated reader, and that's not fun to me. But I still keep coming back to, it's like, why? Why did I love these books so much, and why? What's different? You know, is it just that? And I don't necessarily think it's just that. It's not necessarily that I'm becoming a more sophisticated reader. Writing styles have changed. They do change. And that's something else I wanted to address as well. I've been reading books for decades, for 5 decades. But even then, the books that I read weren't necessarily the books that were written in 1970. When I started picking up reading, I read The Lions of the Witch in the Wardrobe, which was written in the 1940s. I read Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars series. And if you look at the authors of that time, that era, you look at, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, Conan Doyle. If you look at those authors that were writing and publishing or having books published in the 1920s and 30s, the little science fiction and fantasy that we got, and you look at the language and the way those stories are structured, I mean, they still follow the same basic, a 3-part story structure. Some of the longer books are, a 5-part story structure. But let's not get into story elements and writing skills. I'm not that much of a lyrist, but they still follow a standard story structure that we recognize. But the language that they used, the way that the dialogue was done, the way the scenes were described, the way exposition was done, there was a certain cadence to it, a certain rhythm to it, that if you go back and read those, as a kid, as a 10, 11-year-old reading John Carter of Mars, I recognize that these books were written differently. Again, dialogue, pacing. There was something that was definitely different from those books than from the current books that I was reading that were written in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s. I recognize the differences between Isaac Asimov, Larry Niven, Alan Dean Foster, C.J. Cherryh, those other authors that I was reading that were current of that time. So, you have, books of the 20s and 30s, difference of the books of the 40s and 50s, 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s. There are, certain ways in which the stories are told that fit the era in which they were written in. So it's 2025. The books I'm reading that are being written now have their own current story structure, expectations that we have as readers, pacing, how characters are described. They match the culture in which they are written in. The same holds true for television and other media as well. You go back and look at the movies of the 1930s. Look at the dialogue and pacing of the Marx Brothers. Look at Casablanca, Maltese Falcon. But then, and again, move forward to My Fair Lady and Lucas Coming to Dinner and Easy Rider, Papillon. And as you move through the decades, the way in which what we expect of the characters we see on the page on the screen will change based on the current popular culture and the current culture that we're immersed in. You'll notice it's I guess it's easier to talk about the film because if you look at the way the characters in those old films, um, the old black and white films, Marx Brothers, It's a Wonderful Life, Miracle on 34th Street. Look at how they dress. Look at how they talk. Listen to how they talk. Um, there is a certain way in which we expect those people to behave and to speak. They're much more formal in their dress and in their language. And then you push it forward to the 60s and 70s, and people become casual. They become less formal. People in movies in those eras always wore suits. Except, anyone of any means, anyone who was not a farmer, or, you know, basically that was it. Everyone had their uniform, whether it was, a policeman, a taxi driver, a businessman, a farmer. You knew what to expect of a person by how they dressed and how they presented themselves. Fast forward 3 or 4 decades, and all of a sudden, people wear this to the office. You can't tell if someone's a banker by how they're dressed. You can't tell if someone's, a mechanic by how they're dressed. Not necessarily, but you know, things have become less formal, less rigid, less structured in our dress and our mannerisms. People embraced the casual and kind of abandoned the formal, which has its pros and cons, like anything else. So I think that there's some of that as well in my dissatisfaction with the older books. Um, so it's not necessarily all one thing or another. I think because I've become a more sophisticated reader that I am finding it harder to I'm finding it harder to find current books that I like, and I'm being far more critical of the books that I loved as a youth. You know, but I'm also noticing again that and as I said before, I admit most of these things are fluff. I've always admitted that. But coming back to that idea, the knowledge that most of these are fluff, does that mean they're bad? And I can honestly say the answer to that question is no. Just because something is surface level, it's not complex, doesn't mean it can't be enjoyed and it can't be fun and it can't be good. One of the best examples I can give of that, I think, um, is the sitcom Friends. Friends was wildly popular. People loved it, but it was very surface level. There was no depth to that whatsoever, or very little. It was just a bunch of stuff. It was people being goofy. It was funny. I'm not saying it wasn't, but these people didn't tackle any real issues. There was very little depth to these characters. And I know if anyone out there love the show Friends, I'm sure they're going to come back and criticize me. But if you compare something like Friends to something like MASH, MASH tackled real issues a lot. That show was a comedy, but it was, they talked about everything under the sun. They talked about all kinds of social issues. They addressed everything. They had heavy episodes. And there are a lot of other sitcoms that did similar things. Just because it's a sitcom, a half an hour doesn't mean you can't, mention something that's important. Golden Girls is a good example of that. But Golden Girls is also very surface level most of the time. I know people laud that show for its, embrace of diversity, of thought and its openness to treating, elderly people with respect and dignity. It talked about a lot of social issues that affect the elderly and affect everybody. There are a lot of, queer friendly episodes. But again, for almost all that show's runtime, I think the show was like between 23 and 25 minutes long, taking commercials into account. I think the average sitcom is like 22 minutes because of commercials. And the average episode of Golden Girls, 20 minutes of that was them insulting each other, of them being mean to each other. And then you had this 2 minutes of night of good stuff, of deep social construct, deep social conversation, so, and I say that because my wife watches it on reruns. I listen to the Golden Girls all the time. It's always in the background. My wife loves the show. So my knowledge of that show is fairly current. That's why I brought it up. A lot of that is surface level, and people love the show. So I mean, yeah, a lot of these are fluff. They're generic sword and sorcery stuff, plus the sci-fi stuff I got up there too. You know, it's all classic adventure stories. It's modern mythology. It's modern day Odysseus. It's modern day Greek myth, or any other myth you want to talk about. It's modern Babylonian myth. It's modern Egyptian myths, modern Norse myths. All those mythology stories that our ancestors sat around the fires and told each other. Stories of great deeds and legends. You know, now it's in science fiction and fantasy and comic books and the MCU. You know, they're not all deep. You know, a lot of them they just are what they are. And that doesn't make them bad. I've enjoyed all of these books, all these hundreds and hundreds of books, and the hundreds and hundreds that are in storage. When I say I've read 1,000 books in my lifetime, that is not an exaggeration. Although a couple hundred of those are books I had to read for school that I didn't really enjoy all that much. But um, yeah, most of these books are surface level. They're the mental equivalent of an episode of Friends. But that doesn't mean they're not fun, and doesn't mean they're not good or well written. And that's all I got to say about that, I guess. Good hunting.